Sometimes when you do research for a story, you end up thinking to yourself, that could have been avoided, or they should have accounted for that, or, something like that. But in this story, well, this is one that just makes your blood boil. There's no words to describe the utter shamelessness of the people responsible for this tragedy, a tragedy which scarred a nation and killed almost an entire generation of children from one small Welsh village. The village in question is Aberfan, a small mining village situated in the Taff Valley in South Wales. Up until 1870, Aberfan was described in the history books of comprising of only 2 cottages and a local pub. However, after local mining magnate John Nixon opened up Methavale Colliery, Aberfan began to prosper, and by the 1960s its population had grown to over 5,000, and it was a well-established village with shops, a church, schools and a railway station. The main industry in the village was, of course, coal mining. Almost all the working men in the village worked in one form or another in the British coal industry, which at that time was administered by a state-run entity, the National Coal Board, or the NCB for short. One thing about coal mining, it's a messy business, and a lot of what came out of that mine wasn't usable material. A mix of rock, shale, mud, muck and coal powder came out along with the shiny black coal. This stuff was separated at the surface and put to one side as spoil. The trouble was there was a lot of spoil. In fact, it's no exaggeration to say that there were mountains of the stuff. And being in a tight little valley, space was at a premium. Initially, spoil heaps had been created on the lower eastern side of the valley, but it soon became apparent that this couldn't continue. Instead, a network of tramways was created which moved the spoil up onto the western valley top. Carts trundled up and down, day in, day out, tipping the spoil far away from the mine, high up on the tops above Aberfan. This aerial photograph from 1945 clearly shows the tram line and the growing spoil heaps. Now, that was in 1945, so by the time another 21 years had passed, there wasn't just one mountain up there were 7. Each time one spoil heap got too big or became too high to tip on, they'd move the tramway and they'd start another pile off to the side. The problem was they seemed to be running out of room up there, and each new spoil heap seemed to be a little bit closer to Aberfan than the last one. By 1966, spoil heap number 7 was pretty much looming over the northern part of the village, right above where the local school, Panglas Junior School, was situated. Now, this looming mountain of sludge hadn't gone unnoticed by people in the village. There had been growing concerns in the preceding years over the possibility of some sort of slip or slide from the spoil heaps above. And these weren't just vague fears that people muttered about in the pub, these were fears that local engineers had put in writing. Take this excerpt from a letter from the local water engineer, a Mr. D. Jones. Mrs. Williams has advised me that the National Coal Board appeared to be taking slurry up onto the existing tip at the rear of the Panglas schools. If this is true, I regard it as extremely serious, as the slurry is so fluid and the gradient so steep that it could not possibly stay in position in the winter time or during periods of heavy rain. Now that warning is hardly vague or unclear in its message, and this was just one excerpt from many more similar letters. So the danger had been identified and the authorities notified on multiple occasions. Hey, there's a huge unstable mountain of coal slurry up on the hillside above that school and it's going to collapse if it rains heavily. And we're not talking about being in the Sahara here. This is Wales and it can rain heavily right in the middle of summer. So, what did the NCB do? Absolutely nothing. In fact, they went out of their way to shut down any dissent. The message to the people of Aberfan was clear: make a fuss and the mine closes and you're all out of work. 9:15 a.m, Friday the 21st of October 1966. The last day of school before the autumn half-term holiday, and the 200 plus children who attended Panglas Junior School would have been excited. Yeah, it was gloomy, misty, and it had been raining heavily during the week, but they only had lessons till lunchtime and then they would be free for the holidays. Morning assembly was over and they were in the classrooms having the first lesson of the day. Meanwhile, high up above, on the top of spoil heap number 7, crane driver Gwyn Brown looked nervously at the mountain of shifting black sludge. Earlier on, at around 7:30 in the morning, he'd seen the sodden mass moving. He couldn't call back down to the village as the telephone wire had been cut and stolen. And as he looked on, he struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. I was standing on the edge of the depression, and what I saw I couldn't believe my eyes. It started to rise slowly at first. I thought I was seeing things. Then it rose up pretty fast at a tremendous speed. Then it sort of came up out of the depression and turned into a wave. That's the only way I can describe it. It went down the mountain towards Aberfan village. What Glynn had in fact seen was a huge section of the western side of number 7 tip liquefy and cascade down the hillside. 120,000 cubic metres, that's like 50 Olympic-sized swimming pools of liquid mud, muck, rock and coal sludge travelling at an estimated 30 to 40 miles an hour. Halfway down the slope it hit 2 farm cottages, destroying them completely and killing the occupants. Down below, in the school, the children heard a noise that they thought was thunder or a low jet flying over. The sound was described as being overwhelming. It pinned everyone to their seats. Gaynor Magwick, then 8 years old, remembers just putting a foot out to try and run for the door before everything went black. The enormous avalanche of liquefied muck had slammed into the rear of the junior school, smashing in windows, caving in classroom walls, and engulfing the teachers and the children inside. Just to the west, the sludge carried on, smashing through the end of Pantglas Senior School and submerging houses along Moy Road. Then it stopped, and an ominous silence settled over the village, a terrible silence. No screams or shouts for help. Those who were there describe it as eerie. And then people began digging, frantically, looking for anyone who might have survived. Policemen, miners, housewives, firemen, older children, all digging through the sludge, a sludge described as choking, heavy and impossibly thick. A few survivors were pulled free, but they were the exceptions to the rule. From the classrooms in Pantglas Junior School, only 11 children were found alive. 5 of them had been shielded by the body of Nancy Williams, who died protecting them. In another classroom, Deputy Head Di Benyon had tried to do the same. He was found dead after trying to shield 5 children with a blackboard, but his efforts had been in vain. The children died too. The sludge avalanche struck at 9:15 and the last survivor was rescued less than 2 hours later at 11 a.m. After that, the diggers found only bodies. The work continued for days afterwards in terrible conditions. Tip number 7 had effectively behaved like a saturated reservoir, and after the main collapse, water continued to seep down and drain out of the mass above. Down in the village, the morass kept slumping, sliding and refilling voids as the volunteers tried to clear them. It was backbreaking, numbing and exhausting work. The final tally was 144 dead, 116 of those children, most between the ages of 7 and 10. In Pantglas Junior School alone, 109 children died. They were the younger ones who were in the rear classrooms. 6 adults and 29 other children were also injured. They were caught on the fringes of the spill. The people of Aberfan were obviously devastated. A whole generation of village children had been lost, along with teachers and parents. The grief wasn't confined to Aberfan. The news footage of rescuers pulling children out of the muck, the parents who had in some cases lost multiple young children, the rescuers digging for hours until they fell exhausted, all added to a national sense of grief. Donations and condolences flooded in not only from the rest of the country, but from around the world. It was a deeply traumatic event, and the scale of the response to it reflected that. I mean, I can remember my mum telling me about it when I was a kid. I mean, she had nothing to do with it, but she remembered it vividly and the effect that it had on her as she was a teenager in the 60s. In the initial aftermath, the actions of the NCB itself were sorely lacking. The head of the NCB, Labour peer Sir Alfred Robens, Baron Robens of Woldingham, decided that his priority was attending a do that was laid on for him at the University of Surrey, where he collected an honorary degree and had a slap-up lunch and drinks with his chums. Only after that did he bother to visit Aberfan. And even then he went on to say that it wasn't the fault of the NCB, there was no prior warnings, the whole thing was terrible but completely unforeseen. However, the official inquiry would beg to differ. The official investigation into the Aberfan disaster was conducted by the Aberfan Disaster Tribunal, one of the most consequential public investigations in British industrial history. The tribunal's report was published in August 1967, less than a year after the disaster, and it reflected the public need for answers as to what had gone so terribly wrong at Aberfan. Key findings of the report included: tip number 7 had been placed directly over a network of natural springs, a serious error that allowed water to accumulate inside the spoil heap and alone almost guaranteed the failure of tip number 7. The National Coal Board had no policy or system for spoil heap safety, inspection or hazard assessment. They just tipped it where they liked, with no regard for proximity to towns or villages, and then basically just forgot about it. Even palpable danger signs like previous slips were ignored or not acted upon. Warnings from the public were routinely ignored or belittled. Although the responsibility wasn't focused on any one individual, the tribunal did place full responsibility for the Aberfan disaster on the National Coal Board. The report infamously described the National Coal Board's conduct as marked by bungling ineptitude, a phrase that became synonymous with the disaster. However, despite the very clear and unambiguous findings of the report, it also went on to say that there were no villains there, just decent men, led astray by foolishness or by ignorance or by both in combination. In regard to the Aberfan disaster, not one single person was ever charged with any count of criminal negligence. To many, this felt like a whitewash. For years the locals had been worrying and complaining about the dangers posed by the spoil heaps. The inquiry identified the NCB as being solely at fault, and yet, nobody's guilty of anything. Surprise, surprise. Now, there's just one more instance of moral bankruptcy in this case, just in case you didn't hate the powers that be enough already, and that's the poaching of £150,000 from the Disaster Relief Fund to ease the financial burden on the NCB to clean up its own mess. That's right, from the money that had been sent in, from the pockets of ordinary people all around the UK and beyond, money sent in for one reason only, to try and make the suffering of those at Aberfan at least not be compounded by financial hardship. From that precious fund, the government decided to steal £150,000 to give to the NCB to help pay for the removal of the other mountains of sludge that were still up on the hill above the village. At the time, grief and deference kept objections to this largely subdued in Aberfan, but in hindsight, the use of victims' donations to fund the tip removal came to be widely seen as a profound injustice, one that the government finally felt enough shame to acknowledge decades later when it belatedly repaid the money in 1997. But only the original £150,000, mind you. It wasn't even adjusted for 30 years of inflation. Even 60 years on, the Aberfan disaster remains one of those tragedies that, despite being from a different era of British history, it still remains etched into the consciousness of a nation. The terrible imagery from that event, the buried school, the exhausted volunteers, the Queen's visit where she was described as being visibly affected, the mass burial of a village's children, the distraught mother. Not many disasters touched the British public in the way that Aberfan did. Now, the village is still there. The Pantglass Junior School was never rebuilt, though. In its place, there is a memorial garden with a plaque remembering the disaster. Just down the road, in Aberfan Cemetery, are the graves of many of the young victims. The simple white arches stand in long, sombre rows across the green hillside, each one a reminder of a young life that was lost.